Stephen's not present just at this moment, so bear with me. I'm not the best at this, but I think I will start firstly by doing what should be done at all conferences within Australia, and that's firstly, of course, recognise that we're meeting today on the land of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and that we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their relationship to the country. Our first speaker today is Dr. James Juniper, and James, I'll just say a little bit about James. James is a retired lecturer, so half his luck, at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales, and a research affiliate of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity. James' research is both philosophical and applied, and has appeared in various academic journals and as chapters in edited books. James' work is wide-ranging, but is essentially focused on issues relating to modern monetary theory, unemployment, especially regional unemployment, and the environment. James has been a leader in the development of a spatial Keynesian macroeconomics. The conference has referred to ecological economics on a number of occasions, so we've already had a couple of speakers talk about ecological economics. In this morning's presentation, James will be giving a modern monetary theory perspective of the many debates within ecological economics. So I invite you to welcome James to the stage.
Oh, thank you very much. Just wait for the slides to come up. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details on MMT because I think enough people have spoken about that today. What I would like to do is focus on debates within ecological economics and come at them from a slightly different perspective, I suppose. So the motivation is that we need to develop a sort of common, though critical, stance to some of these issues. And I think at the moment people are very confused. There seems to be the need for a trade-off between creation of jobs and employment on one hand, and the need to pull back the environment on the other to reduce resource throughput and the burden we're imposing on the environment through pollution, the need to boost recycling. And there's a lot of confusion over how we can sort of achieve that. And I'm going to begin by looking at some critiques of the mainstream approach to ecological or environmental economics. And I'm going to look at the stance of the social ecological economists and touch on some of the work of the entropy theorists that begins, of course, with Georges Rogan, who was an advisor to the Kennedy government, and of course now Herman Daly is carrying the torch. And then I'm going to look at arguments for preserving the distinction that classical political economy makes between use value and exchange value. And one of the problems that we face in ecological economics is we tend to look at the world through a lens which is given to us by capital rather than by labour. And that will lead me to the eco-socialists, Paul Burkett and John Bellamy Foster, and their notion of metabolic rift. I'll touch on some of the concerns people have about the entropy-based approach, and I'll look at some way of achieving a reconciliation, I suppose, between classical political economy, Keynesian perspective on the macroeconomy, and modern monetary theory, where the emphasis will be on developing metrics or techniques for guiding policy. And I can't go into much detail. In fact, I don't really want to go into detail on this. I really want to just sort of set a broad agenda and come to some conclusions. Okay, so for those of you familiar with Karl Polanyi's work, he was interested in overcoming this separation between the economic and the political. And he followed Marx in recognizing that capitalism is both a driver of innovation but also undermines its own conditions for reproduction, both in terms of labour and in terms of the environment. So attempts to achieve sustainable environmental outcomes are inflected by that same institutional separation. So what arises as a result is this oscillation between allowing sort of free rein for self-regulating markets with all their devastating consequences and imposing sovereign social regulation with the resulting threat of inefficiency and obstruction. I mean, he was writing just after World War II, and for him there were just two solutions. Extending the democratic principle from politics to economics, in other words, socialism, or the abolition of the democratic political sphere altogether, fascism. And of course today we know things are much more complicated and messy than that. So, let's turn to Clive Spash, who's a social ecological economist, and just have a look at this first quote here, where he complains about the threat of environmental degradation. And which he sees as integrally linked to the way the economy is run. And he then moves on to complain about mainstream explanations. And of course, one of the fictitious concepts he's talking about there is obviously the notion of utility, which is highly problematic. Now, there have been the developments of new methods for pricing environmental bads and social goods. But he highlights the fact that environmental problems are still treated as special cases of more general theoretical constructs in mainstream economics. And of course, the most familiar of these is the notion of market failure. We look at public goods, externalities, and so forth. And he warns against treating environmental objectives as a special case of this more general set of constructs. Instead, we need to deploy key biological constructs, which he talks about in this quote, but doesn't really provide us with much detail on how that could be done. He also favours a critique of consumerism, and ridicules the notion that we could take environmental values and reduce them to a single sort of utility-based money metric. We also, of course, need to take institutions and power relations seriously, and he recommends grounding ecological economics in an interdisciplinary tradition, that being the tradition of political economy. So, if you turn to other social ecological economists, some of you might be familiar with the work of R.L. Vartan. He emphasises the role of institutions, distinguishing between the sort of conservative approach of neoclassical economics and the more classical approaches to institutions, and the work of people like Jürgen Habermas at the Frankfurt School, who emphasises communicative action. And on his own part, he sort of highlights the formative influence of institutions over individuals in establishing values and norms, conditioning expectations, and of course, cognitive understanding itself. And these influences of institutions can help to reduce complexity. They can define expected actions and condition our solutions to problems of coordination and so forth. And also they can determine how bounds over our rational decision-making can be dealt with so we can achieve satisficing rather than optimizing outcomes. I don't know, this isn't a particularly good diagram, but it comes from his 2009 text, where he's got the good on the horizontal axis and rationality on the vertical axis, and this notion of human interaction moving along the diagonals away from instrumental forms of reasoning to more communicative or emancipatory forms of reasoning. Okay. Now, there's quite a good paper by Douai, who acknowledges the value of this institutional approach by the social ecological economists. It was important to highlight the role of property rights to regulate conflict, and recognise perhaps some interests that might have been excluded. It helps to acknowledge the historical and contingent nature of institutions, and the fact that efficiency itself is a concept which undergoes evolution. And he also emphasises the role of ideas as ideological supports for certain institutional structures. But he argues we need to apply a more holistic approach that focuses on the need to transform our social relationships with nature, and also the objective social conditions that are themselves responsible for the formation of values and ideologies. But principally he argues for a return to the classical political economist's distinction between use value and exchange value. And he highlights the fact that this is important because when we do things like constructing shadow prices, when we do cost-benefit analysis, often we're looking at problems through the lens of capital. Exchange value is value for capital. In classical political economy, of course, we have a reproduction model of prices. Prices allow industries and the economy as a whole to reproduce itself on an expanding scale. But these are prices that serve the interests of capital and the accumulation of capital. So when we develop metrics to improve or guide environmental policy, we don't necessarily want those metrics to consolidate the reign of capital, as we will. Now, one group of theorists who try to reconcile socialism with the environment are, of course, the eco-socialists, and Paul Burkett and John Bellamy Foster are probably some of the better known, who tend to write in the journal Monthly Review. And their key concept is this notion of metabolic rift. They talk about Marx's concepts of human labour, his notion of a metabolic relationship with nature, and the universal metabolism of nature itself. And of course, Marx did a lot of work on the soil science of his day, pointing out that agriculture goes down the drain with the invention of the flushing toilet. All these nutrients are getting flushed out to sea instead of being put back onto the land. And of course, modern sewage treatment works, many of them now do compost sewage and return it to the land in the form of fertiliser. Now, this concept of metabolic rift came from Marx's analysis of the soil sciences in Das Kapital. And for the eco-socialists, it's their key sort of notion of how we can re-establish or reconcile our metabolism with nature. But I think in some ways the concept is obliged to carry too much weight in their analysis. One of Foster's works, Marx and Earth, takes on a series of claims that Marx and Engels didn't understand the nature of energetics, and particularly the work of the Ukrainian Podolinsky, and that they were very instrumentalist in their approach, viewing nature as the inorganic body of man. Complaints that Engels rejected the second law of thermodynamics, and that Marx's reproduction schemes ignore material flows, or also the complaint that they failed to distinguish between renewable and non-renewable forms of energy, or that Marx's critiques slighted the intrinsic value of nature, and so on. So these are all claims that Foster rejects in a very interesting and readable text. For his part, Paul Burkett looks at Marx's critique of the physiocrats. Of course, the physiocrats were writing during the mid-1700s crisis in agriculture, and one of their member, Kenne, of course, put a lot of emphasis on the role of agriculture in constituting a renewal and real material increases in Renaissance wealth. For the physiocrats, of course, the farmer is the man who feeds us all, and the bounty of nature was seen as the driver of the whole economy. The economic surplus was a product of nature's bounty, and it would be distributed throughout society, and we'd have parasitic classes feeding off it to the detriment of the agricultural workers. But they point out that Marx's theory of exploitation extended to include not just the exploitation of labour, but nature as well. Is that the case? Well, for Burkett, the contradiction between use value, including its natural basis and substance, and exchange value runs like a red thread throughout Marx's analysis in Capital. And Marx also criticised the physiocrat's identification of value with nature's material use value. So he wasn't an instrumentalist in that sense. But it carries with it this unfortunate naturalisation of capitalist forms of valuation. We have exchange value, we have money and profit, and the class relations that underpin them. And to some extent we're in danger of doing something similar with an approach that focuses on energetics and thermodynamic conceptions of entropy. Burkett argues that we need to be careful. We don't need two pricing systems. We don't want a pricing system that's energetic and another one that is labour theoretic. But that raises the question, I suppose, the critical question about how this notion of reproduction prices can properly account for complete and ongoing forms of reproduction. And I mean, at the moment, we're shortchanging nature, if you like. We're not achieving full reproduction of industries and of the economy as a whole because we're running down non-renewable resources. We're using up renewable resources faster than they can be replenished. We are taxing the absorption capacity of the environment, and so on. So we need to extend our analysis of reproduction prices to accommodate these forms of short-changing of nature. And they're the kinds of metrics, I suppose, that we need to develop. Now, there have been Marxist critics of the entropic approach, and if we look at this first quote, it's basically saying, well, entropy doesn't really give us enough insight into what's driving environmental degradation. So I'll just let you have a look at that quote. And of course, we've already had some discussion of one of the major sources of anthropogenic greenhouse gas, and I can think of the burping and farting of pigs and cattle, which of course is productive of methane, which is probably about 4 times more damaging from a global warming perspective than carbon dioxide. So he raises this sort of rhetorical question: why is it so important to overturn the arguments of those he calls the neo-Malthusians, who are the degrowth and steady state theorists? And his response is, like Burkett, he's sort of saying, look, they're overthrowing Straffer's argument for a return to the surplus approach of classical political economy. They're trying to replace the labour theory of value with one based on the use of energy or entropy. And he goes on to, a bit in a hyperbolic nature, to complain that they interpret a problem with a simple geopolitical solution as one that is biological and therefore has a strictly biological solution. For him, biology triumphs over political economy, and here's one of his hyperbolic statements: yes, the earth is too crowded, but it's overcrowded with billionaires. Population stabilises with the reduction of poverty and the empowerment of women. And of course, in China, the one-child policy is no longer imposed or required because economic pressures alone have now limited population growth in that country. So I think Schwartzman just goes too far in his sort of critique of these entropy approaches because we still haven't developed an appropriate reproduction pricing-based approach to valuing what is being done to the environment. One very influential contributor to the ecological debate is Jason Moore. He calls himself an ecological historian. He doesn't like the sort of concept indicator approach, ecological footprints, notions of metabolic rift. He complains that green thought preserves modernity's dualisms between human organisation or society on one hand and the web of life on the other, and also its unidirectional causality. He also says we need to inform policymakers and focus activism. But from John Bellamy Foster's perspective, anything that Jason Moore doesn't like, he labels as dualistic. And he says, look, if you consider his politics, it's pretty close to the vapid politics of Bruno Latour's new economic sociology. So for Foster, Jason Moore is problematic. If we look at some of the more conventional sort of ecological economics, I mean, Commons and Stagel interpret things in an energetic way and point out by 1900, the average human used about 14 extrasomatic energy units that are equivalent to about having 14 human slaves running around with us. And by the end of the 20th century, this had risen to about 19 slaves and said, so I guess my comment is, well, surely we can improve on all of this. So, let's turn to modern monetary theory. In one of his blogs, Bill argued that in many respects, modern monetary theory is probably closer to Marx than to Keynes. For him, the real sticking point was Keynes's view that fiscal deficits should be balanced over the business cycle to pay back debt. And of course, within the Cambridge circus of scholars around Keynes, we had notable followers of Marx who included Piero Sraffa and Mikhail Kalecki on occasions. But if we turn more concretely to what goes on in efforts to model the macroeconomy, it's important to realise that classical political economy is built into two modern forms of economic representation. The first of these is input-output modelling, which Vasily Leontiev introduced. And of course, he escaped from Russia with all these documents under his arm, modelling work from the Soviet Union by economists like Dmitriev, the Ricardian, which had been perfected over decades in Russia. And input-output modelling is very much within that classical political economy tradition. The second form is national income accounting. And here I rely on Peter Fleischer's work. He highlights the fact that for Richard Stone, national income accounting was very much grounded in a classical perspective. If we turn to ecological economics, of course, there are a whole host of studies by industrial ecologists who work with input-output accounting. And those studies include the analysis of waste, studies of the usage of energy and water, rates of recycling, and rates of release of pollution. So we already have many people working within that sort of classical frame. But there's another form of planning which I think ecological economists and activists should consider, and that was a formal approach pioneered in planning by Soviet mathematical economists such as Kantorovich and the Ukrainian Novozolov. Interestingly, in 1965, Jalings Koopmans, the director of the Cowles Commission, visited Russia, interviewed many of the Gosplan planners and many of the mathematical economists. He wrote up a lengthy report in 1965, and what happened was that Kantorovich and Koopmans were both awarded the so-called Nobel Prize in Economics, the Swedish Bank Prize in Economics, for their work in programming. Kantorovich wrote the first paper on linear programming in a plywood factory and was solidly ignored by the Gosplan apparatchiks for about 15 years until the Americans reinvented linear programming, Danzig and his mates. And then Gosplan had to take it seriously. Kantorovich ended up with his own research institute and made major contributions to economic planning in Russia. But what's interesting is these people were using modern techniques, and I won't go into the detail, but techniques of optimization under constraints, and shadow prices reflect the easing of constraints and the impact of that on the minimization of cost. So these shadow prices are resource efficiency measures. But these economists were working not within the neoclassical framework, but were working within the classical political economy framework. And their resource efficiency measures were grounded in the labour theory of value. Now, were these techniques also applied to the environment or to ecological considerations of sustainability? No, they were not. Could they be so applied? Yes, they could. Here are a couple of quotes by G.L.S. Shackle from his book on epistemics and economics about time and logic. And I'll just let you chew through these, if I may. Shackle's a bit of an aberration because he tried to reconcile Keynesian insights into the macroeconomy with Austrian economics. And of course, we all know that Austrian economics is responsible for neoliberalism as we know it. So it's an unusual and remarkable book, but that similar distinction between time and logic is present in the work of people like Piero Sraffa. I've given you a bit of a quote there from Peter Fleischl on the nature of input-output routines and Richard Stone's contribution to the development of the United Nations system of national accounts. In this book, there's also this little footnote about a new approach to defining labour values, which includes the capitalist consumption basket. And the reason I say that is because when I was on study leave in the UK, I met with Ian Wright, who was cited there in that footnote, and found his work incredibly stimulating. And it's sort of, he's a computer scientist, and his work in this area has sort of disappeared without trace. But if anyone's interested, I can give you references. Anyway, the key issue here is this Sraffa quote from Nuno Martins on the Cambridge contribution to the revival of classical political economy. And it's about Sraffa's approach to economics. So I'll just work your way through that quote. And the reason I've included it there is because Sraffa also draws this distinction between logic and time. His concept of reproduction prices is a logical concept. And I think there's a lot of confusion amongst Marxists who are trying to define and clarify the labour theory of value, because they recognise that over time, productivity is a process of pulling labour out of production, both dead and living labour. And that changes labour values. And so they want a system where that change in labour values is actively recognised. And so they say we shouldn't be using simultaneous equations. They're opposed to the use of simultaneous equations in value theory. And I think that's a nonsense if you recognise that reproduction prices are a logical concept, not a temporal historical concept. Sraffa did a lot of work on Ricardo's collected works with the historian Maurice Dobb, and he and Dobb came up with a conception that distinguished between logical and historical time. The subsistence wage, the state of the class struggle, the degree of retention of corporate profits, all these are long-term social norms that develop and evolve historically, but reproduction prices are a snapshot in the economy. So I think that's sort of important to acknowledge. Okay, so how can we pull all that sort of together? Where does that sort of take us? Well, I think economists actually need to be more humble. There are no universal approaches to modelling economic and ecological interactions. We have to modestly collaborate with people from engineering and from the natural sciences in the development of metrics and indicators. We need a variety of approaches to the development of metrics, a horses for courses approach, whether we're looking at water usage or energy usage, or more generally concerns about global warming and climate change. We need different kinds of metrics. We require both aggregated and disaggregated measures, the kinds of things that Phil has been working on, but also we need detailed industry metrics as well. We need to be able to tell from all the panoplies of both existing and potentially viable techniques which we should be promoting and furthering, what kinds of research and development we need to be engaged in. And I guess one thing that's come out from some of the MMT talks today and over the previous 2 days, rather, is that we need to go beyond the neoliberal emphasis on market mechanism design and carbon pricing, and we need a wholesale effort. We need massive investment. I came back from China in November. I travelled from Nanjing to Dalian on super-fast trains that were travelling at 310 kilometres per hour. They've got the world's largest rail network. And they're also building apartments with solar generators on top. They're building massive investments in renewable energy. And, okay, we know they've got big problems with, we've had a lot of media emphasis on Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. I mean, a lot of the problems in the provinces the Uyghurs come from have a lot to do with pollution. There's quite an interesting article in the Journal of Ecological Economics about how those provinces are exposed to some of the worst pollution because they're also sources of power generation with dirty coal. And that has contributed to a lot of the social unrest there. But ecological civilization as a notion has been written into the party constitution. So the second largest economy in the world, or third largest, depending on how you measure it, people are taking ecology very, very seriously, and they're convincing a lot of other countries in the world to invest heavily in new transport infrastructure. In Shanghai, every bicycle and scooter that I saw was electric. They have to fix this problem because they're polluting their own people in Chinese cities. So they have to take it seriously. And I think that in many ways they'll be leading the world. You might have seen the Tesla deal that's been done in China to manufacture Tesla cars now in China. Anyway, we have to inform our choices between these panoplies of existing and potentially viable techniques. I think we can learn quite a bit from techniques of planning in China, which haven't disappeared with marketization and the new thrust of capital. If anything, they've developed and become more subtle and nuanced. So, and by the same token, as economists become more humble, we need other disciplines to recognize the need to go beyond mainstream economic theory. And I'm not providing detailed recommendations here. I'm just saying, look, there is an agenda that we can work on, and that's where I'll finish. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, James. We've got quite a bit of time for questions. So yeah, we've got a question over here.
Yep.
Wayne McMillan here from Mount Druitt, New South Wales. Thank you for a very interesting sort of walk down in the debates of ecological economics, which I must admit I'm not very familiar with. But I noticed that there's been a recent emphasis, even in orthodox economics, on capital labour, not a great deal of emphasis on land. And I'm looking at a fourth factor of production in terms of energy. And I'm wondering whether there has been much discussion in ecological economics on energy as another factor of production.
Okay. I think the notion of factors of production is problematic. And within a neoclassical framework, of course, factors of production are combined in production functions to produce output. And there have been any number of critiques of capital theory. Pierre Estraffa, of course, contributed to that with the production of his book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, in 1960. He and Joan Robinson launched the capital debates, and Paul Samuelson, to his credit, conceded defeat in those capital debates in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And then, of course, everyone ignored them, and it was business as usual. But I think it's difficult to work with production functions. One of my concerns is that a lot of ecological economists work with neoclassical growth models, and they're pretty dodgy. So we need to develop alternatives, and I think there are alternatives out there. We have a whole suite of stock flow consistent macroeconomic models that could be used for ecological modelling. Now, can they account for energy? They definitely can. I mentioned that industrial ecologists already account for energy in their input-output analysis, and that's the kind of approach that I'd be favouring over a sort of neoclassical growth model that plugs energy in as a factor of production. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name's Corey, and after that answer, now I want to change my question. I wondered whether you might elaborate a little bit on some of what you think might be some of the insights that we can look to China and other economies around planning. But now my second question would have been, could you talk or just not prioritise them, but what are some of those macro models that might be useful in an ecological economics context? Because I've had that question for some time.
Yeah, no, good question. Okay, look, there is a group working with a stock flow consistent macro model in Greenwich University at the moment. They try to extend it to account for environmental considerations. Now, stock flow consistent macro models work with transactions matrices and balance sheets and flow of funds accounts. And they make sure that everything is reconciled. There are no black holes anywhere, and they use quadruple accounting based on the work of Copeland, and Minsky as well actually contributed to this. And these models provide a coherence when you're looking at processes of accumulation and relationships between stocks and flows, but they're grounded in a sort of post-Keynesian view of how investment and consumption behaviour occurs. And yes, there is work on trying to extend them to encompass environmental activity. So they're the kinds of models I'd like to see ecological economists using. I mean, at the moment, Peter Fleischl is working with an Australian team of economists on climate change modelling, but they're using the DICE model, which is a neoclassical growth model. And if you look at the history, Keynes was asked to provide a plain English interpretation of a famous neoclassical growth model. That was of Frank Ramsey. I think it was in 1932, but correct me if I'm wrong. And the reason why is because Ramsey couldn't interpret the first order conditions in his model. So Keynes provided the plain English interpretation. Now, Keynes realised the inadequacies of that growth model. He was surrounded by people in the Cambridge circus who contributed to that discussion and that debate. However, most macro models in the world today, especially those of the mainstream, the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, but also new Keynesian models of people like Mankiw and company, are built around a neoclassical growth model at their core. And the neoclassical growth model drives investment and accumulation. And garbage in, garbage out. I mean, I think these models are a disaster, and they've taken the world of economics back decades, you know. We've reinvented the very critiques that Keynes was trying to overturn when he wrote the general theory. The sort of treasury line of people like Arthur Pigou was based on this neoclassical conception. We need to move away from it. And one of the things that MMT has refused to do is engage too much with the mainstream, because why waste your energy bashing your head trying to work with new Keynesians when the foundations of their modelling are crap? So I think we need to go beyond it, you know. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sue Berry. Could you confirm for me, please, this is sort of Socialism, Marxism 101. Is it true that Marx regarded the unpaid labour of women pretty much as we disregard the labour of nature and Indigenous people under colonialism as just a given, as just something you don't have to account for? Because I feel like that's often an assumption made in what I've heard so far about MMT. Of course, I'm talking about traditional labour of women, and now we're a lot more gender fluid, but you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, no, I mean, this is a significant question. But I think people get Marx wrong because when he's talking about capital, they think he's talking about everything. And what he's doing is looking at the world through the lens of capital, and he's saying capital ignores the contribution of nature, and capital ignores the contribution of unpaid labour, because all capital recognises is exchange value. But we also have use values, and unpaid labour is producing use values. Nature is producing use values. And I think one of the problems is that economists, of course, want to be able to develop indicators and metrics for those use values, but they often use techniques that are based on transforming use values into exchange values, so that we're looking at the world through this capitalist lens. And that's really what I'm trying to suggest we shouldn't be doing. So what are the alternatives? Well, we can, of course, use multi-criteria. decision-making, and most ecological economists endorse that or advocate it as a technique. And it can account for things like incommensurabilities and the problem of lexicographic ordering. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you look at a dictionary, the way words are listed in a dictionary, you have to look at all the A's first before we move to the B's and then to the C's. And in utility, we should be privileging things that contribute to our livelihood, our existence, before we look at things that just make us feel good. Okay? And MCDA techniques can account for those sort of lexicographic orderings that highlight things that allow us to survive. And I think also, of course, unpaid labour in a reproductive setting is of that ilk. So it can be accounted for. There are techniques that allow us to account for it. But also we can work within a sort of, I guess what I'm thinking of with reproduction prices is that we can look at, for instance, if we're concerned about global warming, we can get industry metrics that give us resource efficiency measures, but also tell us what that industry's contribution is to global warming. So we can be selective about both techniques and about the kinds of products we want to be promoting or reducing the output of. So they're the kinds of metrics, but we can accommodate the kinds of things you're talking about that are not recognised through this lens of capital.
Thank you.
Rob Fowler, I was interested in your brief reference to the work of Herman Daly and his predecessors on the steady state economy and the degrowth notion. And it's a thought that's been occurring to me in terms of the MMT discussion throughout this program.
Yep.
And also you mentioned that you thought Schwartzman had gone too far in his criticism of that. There's a whole body of sustainability literature, Peter Victor in Canada and others around the world, that are arguing that the economy is a subset of our social political systems and that these are in turn contained by our ecological systems under the broad notion of limits to growth. Yeah. And I haven't heard much reference to that at all at any point in this conference. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, given that you admitted that Schwartzman had gone a bit too far. But do you think there is still a substance in that steady state economy body of work that can somehow fit with the MMT theory?
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to angle at is that if we're working within national income accounting and industrial ecology and this broader sort of framework based on resource efficiency measures, we are dealing with MMT concerns about the allocation of labour and the creation of meaningful employment for all those who want it. Now, how do we reconcile that, of course, with the emphasis on degrowth, resource throughput, taxing the environment? That's really what I'm saying is we need to develop a whole cluster of metrics that account for both labour allocation and labour efficiency, but also the short-changing of nature, which we can also measure along similar lines. I mean, if we're looking at reproduction prices, we have to be able to reproduce industrial activity in ways that doesn't burden the absorption capacity, in ways that doesn't contribute to global warming. So we want metrics that can account both for achieving full employment, allocating labour, and also achieving sustainability. And I don't have detailed answers to how we can do that, but I do have a research agenda, and if anyone's interested in contributing to it, I'd be more than happy to work with them.
Actually, can I just say something?
Yes.
As an ecological economist myself, from a pure ecological economics perspective, I would perhaps suggest that ecological economists do not rely on prices as a means of informing how we sustain economic activity. That it's all about the real resources and the productive capacity of the economy, and of course where the economy sits with respect to the natural environment. If ecological economists do talk about efficiency measures or talk about prices, then it's in fact the prices that are generated as a consequence of making the prior decision to ensure that the rate at which we're using resources generating waste is ecologically sustainable. So how would you respond to that, James?
Well, I think that's entirely true. I mean, what I was talking about was the shadow pricing that people do, in cost-benefit analysis in particular. And I mean, cost-benefit analysis was developed with some remarkable sort of Keynesian economists contributing to the process. I mean, one of the fundamental welfare criterion is the so-called Hicks-Cowdor criterion, and Nicky Cowdor was a member of the Cambridge Circus. And there have been some, significant... Look, I think the issue here is that it's not about... I mean, at times we need prices to guide policy. We need shadow prices to guide policy. But if we want to reconcile our metrics for sustainability with those around labour and full employment, why not recognise that we already have a framework, both in national income accounting, in industrial ecology as well, that's based on classical political economy, and maybe let's work within that frame to develop our shadow prices. And then we can reconcile both of our objectives, the environmental and the employment objectives. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, it does make sense,
Okay.
but I might not necessarily totally agree with that sort of change. But that's fine. We're here to learn.
Absolutely.
I've got something to think about. That's all. Thank
All
you.
right.
But there was one other person up here. This question and one more question. Yeah.
My name's Colin Long from the Victorian Trades Hall Council. This is probably a microeconomic rather than a macroeconomic question, but you raised the issue of Soviet planning versus prices and so on. So it raised this question for me. If you look at the history of look at the national electricity market in Australia. So the history of Australian energy generation, probably until for the first century of Australian electricity generation, the maximum number of generators you had to deal with was probably 50 in the Australian. Now we have 2 million electricity generators, if you include rooftop solar and so on. How do you coordinate such a system without using prices? I'm not a supporter of the market mechanism, but I'm struggling to understand how you coordinate such a system without the use of prices.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that we don't use prices and we don't use market mechanism design. I think the problem is that neoliberal policy regimes have put all the emphasis on market mechanism design and on emission trading schemes to the detriment of what really is required by way of a massive transformation in our processes of production and economic activity. And so, of course, you need mechanisms like NEMCO, and you need markets, and you can improve the way those markets work. And I was just having a conversation with Mark Diesendorf about the inadequacies of the existing NEMCO, because it's going to lead to prices falling below the level which will allow renewable energy, let alone non-renewable energy, to sort of reproduce itself. So I think when we are designing market mechanisms, we need to design them in such a way that they do allow for reproduction. So reproduction prices should be our benchmark, because we need to allow those industries to reproduce themselves. So I don't see that there's an incompatibility there in what I've been saying and what you're saying.
Hello. Oh, yeah. Look, I'm coming at this from a very basic understanding of economics, so please bear with me. I did read Post-Capitalism by Paul Mason, and in that book he did talk about the fact that centralised planning in Russia at the time, one of the reasons it failed was because of lack of information about what was going on in the environment, in the natural capital. And I think with the digitisation of everything, and as we move into the era of big data, will economists or models be able to grapple with the fact that we are hitting our limits and be able to quantify the limits more accurately so that we can have real information? And recently, in New South Wales, I was reading yesterday, the Victorian government was able to quantify their forests and their natural capital a lot more effectively than New South Wales have done. So they know straight away what they're losing. And I'm just wondering how that big data and modern technology and digitisation can factor into helping us quantify what we're losing. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, when I teach ecological economics to my students, I do spend a bit of time talking about the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth report, and then the whole approach of Jay Forrester, who, of course, developed VenSim and software to actually support a system dynamics approach to modelling the economy. And everything was geared around this notion of limits to growth. But of course he's attracted an enormous amount of criticism over the years as well, and people who then responded to that criticism in defending his approach. You have to go into the details of individual models to argue whether they've successfully dealt with this aspect of the social economy or not, or the environmental aspects properly. But I guess I'm personally interested in using the series of quite rich post-Keynesian models out there as an alternative to the sort of system dynamics approach, but extending them to properly account for environmental concerns. And that's really where I'd like to. And they should be able to accommodate your concerns about limits to growth, because that's what's going to be driving the modelling agenda. So definitely, yes.
Well, thank you very much, James. Would
All right.
everyone like to thank James for his very thought-provoking presentation? Thank you, James.
Thank you.